Welcome to 3DLANES number 53. Today, we're talking about ethics and morality in watch pricing. This is a very, very tense topic in the watch community. And to begin, I would like to state three things. First, ethics versus morality. What is ethics? Ethics is basically the society's external rules or standards, society's standards that we usually follow, right, in our society. And morals are more internal. So those are personal beliefs, and a lot of times derived from religion. And the third thing that I wanted to state is that a business, in this case, a watch business, it's amoral, right? So it doesn't have morals because the ultimate goal for a business is to create value for the stockholders. So with those three clear, let's dive into the topic. I think there's a huge gray area on the cost of manufacturing watches. A lot of times you can guide yourself by, quoting if you were gonna make your own watch through suppliers, right? Online. Google is a good resource for that. It doesn't give you the full picture because not everybody's doing watches the same way. But let's say, for example, basic watches cost between $50 to $150 to make, right? Very basic stuff. And a high-end luxury piece, let's say between $500 to $700 or $1,000. But usually this finished watches retail for 5 to 20 times the cost. And a lot of times you have to factor in, which people don't usually do, the overhead, the hours that people put in to assemble the watches, to test them, and all that stuff, right? QC. There's many things that you can do to, or that you must do to have the end product in your hands. So we can say that a Rolex valued at $8,000. Some people say that costs approximately $500 to produce, and it's a exponential increase in the price. And a luxury watch that can retail at $2,000 maybe may cost manufacturing cost, not everything else, right? It costs between $500 and $700. This is raw materials and machining and assembling. That's it. That's all it is. But there's other breakdowns, right? That you can find around the web that said, stainless steel case costs between $5 and $15. And this is something that I've made an episode about before, which if you want some detailed numbers that I was able to procure, then you can go back and listen to that. But there's no full transparency in the supply chain, which it is very, very interesting. This is one of the industries, one of the, I don't know, I'm not gonna say few industries, one of the industries that lacks fully transparent supply chain. I don't think it's very common. We're getting there because the customers are demanding that transparency, but it is not completely there. Uh, for example, another example actually, uh, the distribution chain of Rolex, for example. An authorized dealer can buy a $10,000 Rolex for around 6K, right? And then they make those $4,000. But that's only the price of the watch. And then from there, they have to pay other things like employees and all that stuff, right? Like overhead, meaning the rent for the building, the electricity bill, and all that stuff. So those are things that can be justified. So you can have other expenses like technology, meaning the software that they use to make the transactions, all that stuff, insurance, and administration staff, and all that stuff. So there's plenty of cost to start getting chunks of that profit, or start getting dismembering that profit into tiny pieces until you get, I don't know how much they would actually make, but some some other justifications for pricing is the brand itself, the name of the brand. A lot of brands have an upper hand because of the name, because of the heritage of how long they've been around. So luxury watch brands defend premium pricing through this argument. Some of them have hand assembly, craftsmanship, represent a legitimate cost driver. Some brands employ teams that spend hundreds of hours on individual watches, with skilled watchmakers that demand higher salaries, right? Because there's not a lot of them out there, and not a lot of them are experts on the same thing. There's also premium materials and other testing standards that contribute to production expenses. But brand heritage, which industry analysis suggests accounts for 20 to 40% of a luxury watch's total price. This is basically the quote unquote decades or centuries of reputation building and innovation that a brand has put into. But another one is control production strategies, meaning creating artificial scarcity, uh, reflect genuine business rationale. Uh, Limited production ensures quality control, right? That's a given for big companies. That protects the brand prestige, and you probably know some of the brands that I'm talking about. One of them could be Rolex, right? They maintain the healthy demand equilibrium by not overproducing watches or pretending that there's not a lot, quote unquote, pretending, right? That there's not a lot out there. But research and development, investments in movement innovation and materials engineering, like the Rolex Oyster Steel or the Omega's liquid metal, supposedly they incur substantial cost that must be amortized across production runs, right? So that's why economies of scale are important. But operating cost encompass retail infrastructure requirements, staff training, international distribution, inventory management. So it's not just the physical components of the watch. So for a big manufacturer, there's a lot going on there, right? So some of the ethical concerns here would be supply chain and transparency. But so we have manufacturer justifications, but significant ethical concerns are quite a few in the watch industry, and the supply chains for precious metals. It's one of them, meaning gemstones, or again the precious metals, frequently lack transparency regarding human rights practices. Human Rights Watch has documented that jewelry and watch supply chains involve complex procurement systems where gold and diamonds may be sourced from companies or countries where human rights ab- uh, are abused. But the organization found that most of the 13 major jewelry and watch brands examined in this study, you could call it, had strengthened supply chain practices since 2018. So there's still some gaps in there, but they're doing their due diligence. But for example, Loro Piana, which is not related to the watch industry, but it's part of LVMH, so it's worth mentioning. They face judicial oversight following investigations into labor exploitation, with court documents revealing that intermediaries producing jackets of 120 euros per piece, saw them retail for over 3,000 euros. So it's a markup of 25x. And but at the same time, that is, I would say that's, ooh, that one's a tough one because well, okay, let's limit to the data, right? So they're producing 120 euros per piece, or meaning producing the piece costs 120 euros, sorry. But they're selling for 3K. If there's people paying that, then that's ethical, right? Because what's the end? What's the end of the business, or the end goal of the business? Sorry, is to create more value for the stockholders. Now, when there's labor exploitation, then that's different. That's something else. But because that's unlawful, so if it's within the law, I guess you could call it technically ethical. And while the watch industry's labor practice appear less extensively problematic than broader luxury fashion, the fundamental issue remains: transparency is insufficient to allow consumers to verify ethical production claims. Now, if we move to the next pricing practice or justification, we could call it psychological pricing and perceived value. So the watch industry uses very sophisticated psychological pricing tactics that raise moral questions. And this is about consumer manipulation, right? So luxury brands, they use round even prices like just straight up $5,000 or $10,000, rather than, like 5,000, $5,025. There's no fractions. It's a full price. This is not illegal, but this is a psychological game that it's used in marketing to make you perceive the pricing in a different way. So if it was 4,999, then that's you rationalize it thinking that it's closer to 4K than 5K, right? Because you don't see the 5, but technically you're closer to 5. But this is a psychological game, basically. They're leveraging consumer psychology to reinforce perceptions of luxury and exclusivity. So there's another one called anchoring. Uh, Anchoring tactics position high price models alongside lower price alternatives to make the latter appear more valuable. So let's say you have a $10,000 watch, and then you have another a $20,000 right next to it. Then it makes the higher price option appear to be a relative bargain. So next time you see it in a store, think about it. Think about those things. But industry analysis reveals that luxury watch buyers often prioritize the status symbol and image associated with prestigious timepieces over objective measures of quality or functionality. So, for example, Patek Philippe, they have this slogan: "You never actually own a Patek. You merely look after it for the next generation." So this basically makes you think, oh, this is gonna survive everything, right? So I'm gonna be able to pass this one down, and it's never gonna lose its value because it's such a heritage piece. But this emotional positioning allows brands to justify prices that significantly exceed in just the intrinsic value of the piece, right? So raising ethical questions about whether such marketing constitutes responsible consumer engagement or sophisticated exploitation of aspirational psychology, that's the question. But it's not illegal, so you could argue that it's ethical, right? It's trying to sell the brand. So that's where the balancing act that we find ourselves in. So I guess questioning transparency in all those ends, it's one big question. But another established brands that have a adopted the transparency kind of movement, you could call it, or initiatives. For example, Zenith, they published a comprehensive responsible business practices policy, uh, and it says that it prohibits child labor, forced labor, and human rights violation across its supply chain. So whenever they adopt a supplier, because you're technically marrying your supplier, you establish a long relationship with them. So when you do that, their supply chain practices reflects yours. That's why a lot of times, even if the brand's not directly responsible, it can look responsible for whatever their suppliers are doing. But however, industry leaders including Rolex, Omega, and Patek, they maintain confidentiality about exact product costs and supply chain details because they say there's competitive sensitivity there. So, that's another one. They're not forced to do that. It's not their obligation. Some brands choose to do it because a lot of customers, or more customers nowadays, are wanting more transparency about their products or whatever they buy. So that's why they do it. Will everybody end up doing it? I don't know, but I see a trend going towards that direction. So we'll find out. Now, question the value proposition. A growing, I don't know. There's some skepticism within the watch enthusiast community about price justification. There's a lot of skeptics about either or of those practices that I mentioned above, but industry critics say that while some watches employ genuine hand assembly and finishing, not everybody does it, right? So many luxury watches actually use advanced automated manufacturing that could theoretically support lower pricing. So is everybody being transparent? That's the question. Modern machine-made watch movements achieve exceptional consistency and precision at a fraction of hand-assembled costs. But market positioning elevates prices regardless of production methodology. So that's not something that they look at. So I don't know. I guess you could try to dig deeper for the brand that you're gonna buy, and you might be able to find something. But it's tough. Not everybody's transparent. Fratello, for example, if you don't know Fratello, it's a huge we could call it like online magazine, um, a huge platform, by the way. They have questioned whether rising prices reflect inflated greed rather than genuine value increases. So the analysis they made notes that some brands have confirmed revenue increases when raising prices, but they have failed to show improvements in product quality or functionality. So this suggests that pricing reflects uh, what the market will bear rather than cost-based valuation. So I don't know if I could call it an ethical question about whether consumers are receiving commensurate value, but it's kind of like the same thing that we spoke before, right? Like if somebody's going to pay for it and you're increasing prices, the market's going to pay what the market's going to pay. If there's still people paying for that, if you increase the price, then your goal as a business, not as a person, as a business, is to increase the whatever you make for the stockholders, right? So that's the reality of it. But from the corporate perspective, luxury watch brands, they operate within competitive markets where market value often exceeds manufacturers' suggested retail price. Rolex, for example, they sell between 80 to 150% above MSRP on the secondary market. That is a topic for another time when the secondary market exceeds the primary market. But some analysts argue that brands are actually underpricing relative to market demand. Right, what I was saying, like people are willing to pay that price. But from a shareholder perspective, failure to capture available market value would be you cannot defend it. And the existence of slight over demand represents healthy business equilibrium. So preventing the brand from building unsustainable on peak demand. But the business logic creates, I don't know if I would call it a moral paradox, maybe. But if the market value justifies higher pricing, should consumers absorb the cost differential? Should brands increase prices to capture market value themselves, or should they expand production capacity to meet demand at existing pricing points? Huh, those are the questions. So these represent fundamentally different ethical philosophies about brand responsibility. Let me repeat the questions. Should the consumer absorb the cost differential? Meaning, should the customer pay the price? Should brands increase prices to capture market value themselves? Meaning, should they pump out more watches to make more money for themselves? Or should they expand production capacity to meet the customer where they're at? Right? So those are the three questions. Pay more in secondary, increase prices to capture value yourself, or meet the customer where they're at. Hmm. So this is an interesting topic for me, and this is something that we're covering in my MBA this week, this module. And again, at the end of the day, a business is amoral, right? So the class compared it as a kind of like a sociopath because they cannot relate to people's feelings, right? The only thing in mind is make more value for the business and the stakeholders. So I don't know. It's a it's a very delicate subject, very tense subject within the watch industry, I think. Not a tense subject where everybody gets angry and arguing about it, but more like tense of like, the customer, the enthusiast doesn't see where everything comes from or where everything goes. So there's a lack of transparency that maybe people don't appreciate. And a lot of times, a lot of people believe that they are being played by the brands, which they might, right? But how much of a luxury product's price should reflect intangible factors like heritage, status symbol positioning against concrete value creation through materials, craftsmanship, ethical practices? And I don't think I don't think we're gonna get an answer soon, but I think the watch industry and most industries are moving that way. So this is a very, very interesting topic. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you believe that you see the transparency in the industry of all the brands. I know there's brands that are as transparent as they get. I know a few. I know people in it in the industry, thanks to this MBA actually and the projects that I've done, and it's very, very appreciated. How people are willing to be transparent, and I'm talking about small brands, independent brands. But again, let me know what you think. Let me know your thoughts on this subject. I appreciate your time. Thank you for sticking till the end. I am Denny. I will see you next time.